Welcome back to Security and Compliance Weekly. Hey, InfoSec World 2021, which of course is going to be held virtually this year, November 9th to 10th, is proud to announce its keynote lineup for this year's event. Hear from Robert Herjavec, plus heads of security at the NFL, TikTok, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Stanford University, and more. Security Weekly listeners can save 20% on the digital pass registration. To get this discount, go to securityweekly.com/ISW 2021 and register today. Also, while you're on our website, you can check out our next live webcast, which is coming up on November 4th, which will be about pragmatic steps to reduce your software supply chain risk. Also coming up is November 11th, learning the key insights and takeaways from the 2021 OWASP Top 10. You can sign up for both of those by going to securityweekly.com/webcasts, register, and then of course, if you want to have access to any of our burgeoning library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings, you can find them at securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right, back to it. So you had asked me to weigh in on a question at the end of the first segment, Tony, and obviously there's no really good answers to any of these things, which is why we talk about them. I see a value. There's value in everything, and I guess that's part of the problem. There's value in everything we do, and everything has its limitations. And I think the trick is finding the sweet spot for, at least from my perspective, as sort of an external third-party advisor, security expert that comes into organizations. What I try to do is find out what people are going to be responsive to. Sometimes that's reading them the letter of the law. Sometimes that's explaining to them what I just said, what it means, because they have no context. Sometimes it's, well, they're doing something, especially from a technology perspective, completely different. And how does this all even apply anymore? So PCI actually is getting ready to release version 4 early next year, and they've been going through some major revisions. They've taken 2 years to do it. I guess they took the extra time in the lockdown to try to get it more right. And I'm sworn to secrecy about the details of the changes, but I can say that a lot of consideration is being given to the fact that so many organizations these days are taking advantage of newer technologies, little things like mobile devices and apps and alternative payment methods and cloud computing, cloud outsourcing. I think you've got every letter of the alphabet as a service these days that's available through the cloud. And part of the marketing pitch for going to the cloud, a lot of companies hear, they may not be being told this, but they hear, come to the cloud, we'll make your security issues go away, we'll make your compliance issues go away, we've got you covered. And really they're just trying to sign them up and pull them over. And they rely at times on organizations not reading the small print and finding out that not only do your security concerns not go away, in fact, it might be even a little bit harder and more expensive because you gotta learn new things, you gotta learn new ways of doing things, and it's not as straightforward, and it's not all necessarily done for you, at least not for the price that you were advertised. So it's a complicated environment. I'm curious, and Thomas, I don't know if you have visual aids, but what does some of the work that you've been doing look like? How does the mapping work? And if you can speak to it and show us a little bit, I'm sure we'll have questions.
Well, I sure didn't bring any visual aids, but there's no
finger puppets or something.
If there's a trick to it, I sure haven't found it, and I've sure talked to a few people that have been trying to find it. Most of my life in that regard is just having both frameworks open in front of you and going line by line, and if you don't understand something enough, having to go on a research tangent to see exactly what you think they mean, which, as we've been talking about, is somewhat troublesome.
Right.
But this is why I have 3 screens on my home computer, because when you're doing mappings work, you really need the space.
Well, you alluded to that the mappings are mostly technical in nature. I guess, I mean, I know PCI like the back of my hand. That's the back of my hand. Have you mapped PCI to other things? Have you mapped other things to PCI?
Yes, I mapped PCI to the CIS controls version 8,
Okay.
and I also assisted the Cloud Security Alliance with their mapping to PCI.
Okay.
So I'm quite familiar with it as a
And
framework.
how did PCI hold up?
I liked PCI a lot. I'm not going to lie. There were frameworks I liked less. They shall remain unnamed, but but they're pretty clear. Like, all I really want is a list of things with like a name and an alphanumeric indicator, and not that many asks in your paragraph or two of text. Not everybody follows that philosophy, and that's purely just for my sake and for like the auditor's sake, because you need a number, and you need what you want accomplished with that number. But if you're so we're trying to stick to this neat little one ask per control thing, where some of them can sprawl a little bit, or their smallest, their most discrete control is still 2 pages of text or what have you. And so the more you can divvy it up, the easier it is for me anyway. And so, as an extremely biased individual, that feels the best way to me.
I don't know if they still have this, Jeff, but PCI used to publish this PCI document called Navigating PCI. And it was the same list of PCI requirements, but it had details on what how the QSA should test it or gather the evidence and things like that. And I found that really helped me to understand the intent of the requirement and what they're looking for.
Yeah, well, there's several different aids available from PCI these days. A lot of the guidance and expectation has actually been built into the standard itself, and then the sort of companion document, which is everybody has to fill out the same report template these days. And again, in the report template are the detailed instructions of the testing procedure, what the QSA, or optionally you can do it internally if you're an ISA, internal security assessor. But it does, they've done a lot to try to explain the context and the meaning of all the different requirements. The problem remains, and they acknowledge that this is a problem. So many of the organizations that are subject to PCI, because of their transaction volume, they are smaller merchants or service providers, and therefore they get to be eligible for self-assessment questionnaires, which are often, well, they are quite literally a checklist. They don't have the requisite detail like the standard does, although they've attempted to put some of at least the highlights of the testing procedure into it. But quite frankly, if all you're looking at is a checklist, for some reason, people won't read the companion document. They go right to the SAQ, which is like the Cliff Notes, and they just want to check the box. That's a big problem that the council's aware of. Actually, a lot of the efforts coming with version 4 is to try to provide that much more education, FAQ, guidance documents to support companies that aren't going to be talking to a QSA, that are simply going to the self-assessment questionnaire and trying to navigate it successfully. But as an editorial note, I'll be honest with you. I work on a team of QSAs that we probably averaged 10 years of experience as being QSAs or close to it, and there's 30 or 40 of us. We scratch our heads sometimes and try to figure out how to apply which SAQ, which is the right one for which entity, and we're the experts, and we're scratching our heads trying to figure it all out. I have no idea how companies that don't do this for a living, make heads or tails of it, that I'll they usually do it wrong, and they usually get bad guidance from somebody else, usually a vendor, that puts them on the path to non-compliance, but at the same time telling them you'll be fine, just implement our tools and our technologies, we got you covered.
Well,
yeah. Go ahead.
To bring this back to maybe a question for Thomas, I think there's two levels of understanding a requirement there. There's understanding the intent, what they're looking for in that requirement. And then I think part of the reason we end up scratching our heads is every time we're presented with a new environment, like cloud, for example, like a lot of the requirements don't really need to change for cloud. You just have to understand cloud, first of all, and if you're dealing with a new customer, you need to get to know that customer and understand that customer. And then it's like reading the requirement for the first time sometimes, because you're thinking of it in completely different context, than you have in the past sometimes. So I guess, the question there is, I assume that goes into how you word it somewhat, like you want to have in your mind, well, this might be applied to this environment or a cloud environment, so you don't want to word it too specifically so that it's difficult to understand in those contexts. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think cloud in particular is an excellent example of what you're talking about here, because it did kind of require a change in thinking, and it did immediately invalidate some language. Like if you look at all your versions of the controls, I think the best example of this would be talking about backups. Like imagine the sort of ideal for the perfect backup system for some of the slightly older people on this call, which involved maybe physically unplugging the backup and making sure it was not accessible to the network or anything like that. If you have language,
mag tape.
Yeah, exactly. If you have language involving mag tape and not always accessible, or not connected to the internet in your control about backups, as soon as cloud became a thing, that just immediately you could have a perfectly adequate backup scheme, but it just doesn't work with cloud. Like by the letter of how you wrote it, if I used cloud for all of my backups, I would not be meeting the terms of that control, even though my entirely cloud-based backup scheme could be just as secure and not reliant on one guy not tripping and falling with the mag tapes down the hall or something.
Yeah. What? Oh, the mag tape thing hurts, by the way, because I think I wrote that in an earlier version. But the point here, and I think you brought us down an interesting thread, which is what we have tried to do. And again, we're not claiming we've solved world hunger here, but by being crisper and more discreet in what you ask for, right? What I've found, and I'm working on another set of requirements for yet another field in IoT, helping some framework writers for that. And the challenge with framework writing is people try to put everything into they put everything they know into every paragraph, right? And they munge together the rationale with what you think people ought to do about it, with how would I measure it and how would I test its effectiveness. And if you kind of let all that get mingled together, it's really hard to untangle. And so understanding, right, what is in Thomas's example, the purpose of the backup? Well, you want to make sure that the malware, or the say ransomware, can't get to that, get to the user's backup. And now how you do that can depend on the technology. Right? Do I physically remove the tape, or do I have a mechanism that moves it into a different space, right? That can be managed by a vendor, for example, a cloud service provider. But by separating those, you get a much sort of cleaner way to address these issues of I'll call it technology dependence. And then what we did, just as an example, here's a thing we're exploring at CIS, is looking at all these what we call safeguards now, these subcontrols, which equate roughly to a control in NIST language. And because we've written them more discreetly, there's at least a possibility of automating a test to verify that thing is being met. And it turns out some significant percentage, I'm sorry, I don't remember the number, it's like 60% or so of the things we ask for in the CIS controls lend themselves nicely to a statement of what are the system artifacts or things I would measure to tell me that the intent of this is being met. And we've published that now as a specification. right? That a vendor can pick up and say, oh, I can build that into my tooling. And the idea then, is always the same, right? Let's automate what can be automated. That is a set of tools that follow a specification that are tied to the things that we ask for in the CIS controls. And that's a much cleaner, again, sort of workflow. And that's the way we try to think of this. What's the entire workflow that would allow us to not only say what's important, but measure that's in fact there, or measure its performance or its presence or whatever you think is important. So that's another way to think of this. But I think that's a healthy, this idea of the technology affecting the rationale. If you kind of put them all together, it's really hard to untangle that, in my experience.
Does that lend itself to scalability across larger organizations where you end up with multiple segments, multiple disparate networks, even different business units that operate autonomously? Or is that still effective and efficient?
Yeah, I think that the goal, right? I grew up in the Defense Department, and back then, certainly 80s, 90s thinking was, we have a problem here. Therefore, we're going to buy one tool for the entire DoD. And if you know what that means, oh my gosh, it's unthinkable, right? There's no one tool that operates in it. But the idea was they wanted central visibility. And the thinking there was, well, I will call centralized control of execution, right? Everyone has the same tool, and let the vendor figure out how to roll all this stuff into one dashboard or one view or one set of metrics or whatever. And that has never worked because of the scaling, right? It's just, you're trying to get networks that run in the sand in risky locations, right? They're getting shot at, and things that operate in space and fixed plant worldwide networks. There's no one tool that does any of all that. But what you really want is central visibility, but through, I'll call, distributed execution. So you want a set of tools that are kind of appropriate to the environment you're trying to manage, yet knowing I've got to roll up a picture of the DoD, right? Where are the weak spots? If a new flaw is found in a piece of software, where are the risky locations in my enterprise, no matter what IT they're running? The only way you can get that at scale is through some sort of standardization, right? It doesn't mean you all buy the same tool. It means they all speak, I'll call it, the same language. I can give commands. Tell me how many pieces of this version of Microsoft Exchange are out there that are outward facing and have these characteristics. You want to be able to ask that question in a machinable way and get an answer back in a machinable way, no matter what thing they're using to run in their environment. If that makes sense, right? So my catchphrase back in those days was central visibility, but local execution. And so that's how you get scaling. It's not through making things the same. But you do need, if you want to do things at scale, you have to standardize at some level, but it's not the tool level. It's really at what I'll call the language level. How do I talk to tools, and how do I get information? And that was the driver behind things like NIST had a program for years, it's still around, called SCAP, the Security Content Automation Protocols, which encapsulated a bunch of standards that were focused on exactly that problem.
So I'm curious, I think you've been saying this, and I'm trying to process and make sure I'm hearing correctly. You've said you focus on mapping the technical controls. I in my limited experience beyond PCI, I could see that there are a lot of organizations that probably get wrapped around the axle on not just the technical controls, but on the reporting aspect, or the proving that you're doing what the technologies or the manual process claims. Is there a difference in measuring when you're mapping not just the technical controls, but perhaps the how do you prove it aspect of the exercise? Or is that a little too esoteric?
Well, measuring these things is kind of like the goal for many people. We see a lot more people kind of, attempting to input what controls are relevant into scanning tools than we certainly, did in the past. And that makes sense with the technical controls. That does not make as much sense with the policy controls. And with the reporting of the policy controls, that complicates it even more. Like if the control just says have an incident response policy, that's a yes, no. Like I don't need to have my scanners check every week to see if I still have a policy. But if I have to, review and update it every 6 months, or I have to report it out to a different part of the company, or for legislative reasons to be in contact with other entities, that is definitely a complicating factor to the measurement aspect of it. And the measurement is really a big thing these days.
Yeah, that's great, Thomas. And I would add to that, again, the controls are not a replacement. We're not intended to be, or not designed to be a replacement for like the NIST 800-53 catalog. I call that the Sears catalog of controls, right? And Jeff, you're old enough to remember a real Sears catalog, right? A big hunk of paper, like yay thick, and all that.
Yeah.
Yep. The controls are about, and the benchmarks, right, are about priority, about focus. What are the set of things I really need to do, based upon an understanding of the attack world and what bad guys are doing and all that kind of stuff. And another thing I'll mention briefly. So why do people write these recommendations, right? And how do they write them? We're on a multi-year path at CIS to bring data under the hood to why do we recommend this thing but not that thing, and we do that by tying them to attacks. If you're interested, we have a paper that just came out, to version 2 of the community defense model, which is a way to take open public data sources like the Verizon Data Breach Report, the equivalent from CrowdStrike, and all those kinds of annual reports from those sort of threat intelligence companies. They give away these threat intelligence reports with summaries of what they've seen. We use those to identify the most important set of attacks that we think everyone should worry about. We formalize the description of the top handful of those kinds of attacks, these sort of classes of attacks, using the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And I'm guessing you're pretty familiar with that sort of stuff, Jeff. And then you look at the sort of resulting, what we call attack patterns, and we match them up against our individual recommendations. If we have recommendations that don't match to some sort of common attack pattern, then why are we recommending it? Is it just a good thing to do? And one of the problems in this industry is that there's 10,000 good things you could do, but you'll never do, right? They're too expensive, it takes forever, and so forth. So you need a way to focus your attention on things that are really important. And we measure importance by statements of what the bad guys are really doing, not what old guys like me dream up. I got trained, and Jeff, you were too, right? We're great at brainstorming a million ways to attack systems. Some of them are great and realistic, and some of them are just ideas. And you sorting through that to focus in on the things that really matter, right? Which are real viable attacks being demonstrated to us every day by bad guys, translate them into a formal expression, and look at defensive recommendations. Do they provide you any specific value against those patterns? That's kind of the model that we are developing now. And that it helps us. We want to be able to say with a straight face, we're not just recommending things because they're good. We're recommending them because here's the value that they give you against these common attack patterns. And then again, we think of this as a workflow thing. Others, are more comprehensive, right? They sort of imply that you should figure out what's important based on your management's risk appetite is the term, your dependencies, your threats. I get it, but I call that the special snowflake school of security. And my experience with big, highly funded federal agencies is that most of them cannot execute that with any confidence or fidelity, right? They just don't have the kind of people and the threat feeds and information that would allow them to do that. So we in effect crowdsource that through CIS, but that model of establishing importance, then deciding what are the really important recommendations, and then making sure we map them, find a way to automate them wherever possible. And then to close up on Tom's point, a lot of people take our work and then they embed it in larger decision processes using GRC tools or things like that, right? We're not trying to tackle the whole problem. We're trying to bring focus and priority to really the technical actions that have the most value, but recognize that at the end of the day, this is so that executives make good decisions, or security architects make good decisions. And so we want to put the information in the form that really works for them, that really speaks to what they're trying to accomplish.
So I hear what you're saying, Tony. Oh, go ahead, Tyler. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I was just saying you're prioritizing qualitative and quantitative sides of things that people are having a really hard time kind of building a plan, security roadmap, maturity roadmap around, in order to be able to demonstrate those different metrics and provide some real proof without having to do a pen test or a security assessment. This is more or less doing that for you in a certain manner.
Well, if you kind of a basic premise, right? What I'm really telling you, our basic principle here is that the phrase I use, Tyler, is in cyberspace we all have more in common than we do that's different, but we don't act like it, right? So there's just a soup of bad stuff that's happening out there. And again, most enterprises, when I say most, I'm not exaggerating. Most of our economy small businesses in particular, right? That's what really drives the U.S. economy in terms of numbers and so forth, can't defend itself. They're not going to read threat reports. They don't have a cyber person on staff. They don't, it doesn't make sense for them to kind of build security themselves because they just don't have the capability to do that. But the good news is they don't really have to, right? Because all that bad stuff applies to them, whether they know it or not. So the idea is to sort of bring, that's what we do as a volunteer-driven nonprofit, right? We can bring together lots of information, lots of smart people, and then the verb that really matters in cyberspace, I call it, is not share. Everyone would think, oh, if we just share, everyone will get smart and they'll know what to do. That doesn't work. Translate is the verb that matters, right? How do I translate millions of data points of badness into a small number of positive, constructive things I can do about them? And that's the exercise that most cannot do on their own. And again, they don't really have to. Again, we're not trying to solve world hunger, but to 80, 90%, if you can get, and that's kind of the value of, you could call it good practice or best practice or hygiene or doing the foundational or basics or whatever. Frankly, that's what's happening in the tax space, right? We're getting hit by millions of repeats of the same old garbage over and over again.
That is one of the main problems, right, that we do have is a lot of the places don't have to do any of this. That's where kind of Jeff's compliance thing comes into play, adds a little bit of teeth to this. But are you guys working with, say, like cyber insurance companies? I think they have one of the strongest arguments for affecting change across the largest swath of verticals without having to be under an umbrella of a certain compliance regulation, where you're actually bringing some of those methodologies and recommendations to those places, but without teeth. What's kind of the incentive and ability to push this? So is there collaboration with other organizations that maybe have teeth that can provide some of that backing and can leverage you in a more meaningful manner where you're already doing the work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we are in regular conversation with lots of the insurance industry, the legal industry, and so forth, and all that's I think in flux. Ransomware has really turned that industry on its head, right? It used to be that all the insurance companies were writing cyber policies and, they were better at managing their own risk than they were at managing the customer's risk, frankly. That is, they control the payouts and the exclusions and so forth. And everyone needed to be in the industry. But the rate of ransomware payouts has caused everyone to rethink what it means. And therefore, there's a lot of rethinking about what does it mean to be insurable? What evidence would make that a reasonable risk on the part of the insurance company, right, to give you an insurance policy? And how much should I charge you for it? I think that's kind of up in the air right now. My advice would be and we deal with a lot of these things as a nonprofit, right? We're dealing with the whole spectrum of the industry. I think the action right now is in state governments. You talk about incentives, and the Ohio Data Breach Protection Act. This is a whole, another episode if you wanted to go into it with real experts. But a number of states now are moving out, have moved out on some legislation that, and a lot of it is modeled after the Ohio Data Breach Protection Act. And it says something like this. I'm going to cartoon it a bit. If you handle this kind of data and you do business in our state, then you must use, and for heaven help me, I'll use air quotes, reasonable security practices as defined by, for example, the NIST CSF and or the Center for Net Security's critical security controls. All right. So it's what it's doing is it's saying, if you do that, and you follow these reasonable practices, then, and this is, the model is really turning into voluntary incentivized adoption, right? If you handle this kind of data and you use these kinds of practices as defined by these frameworks, then you will be given some amount of, I'll call it safe harbor. I'm not a lawyer, by the way, but some sort of legal protection, liability protection against certain kinds of lawsuits, caps on the payouts, punitive damages. And that turns out to be, I think, the really interesting example of what's happening, right? It provides an incentive for companies to change their behavior, but it also brings them into interaction with the insurance companies, right, who are helping them manage the total package of risk. And so that's picking up momentum. There's a handful of states that have already moved down that road, and that others that are on the cusp of that. But that's where I'm paying attention, and we are paying attention at CIS, and encouraging and working with state legislators. And we've done several webcasts on that topic. If anyone's interested, go to cisecurity.org and you can find that kind of information. But that's kind of where the action is right now. There's federal discussion of those kinds of incentivized voluntary models. They're not as far along. Things take longer in DC. That's just a fact of political life.
So thank you for mentioning your website. I was going to ask Thomas or Tony, the fruit of your labors. How are you putting that out to the public? Is it something that's free, something we have to pay for, subscribe to? I, as an assessor, might want to share it with one of my customers. Where do we find it? How do we go get it?
Thomas, where's all your stuff? I'm not even sure.
Well, the best insight into my work is on the CIS Controls Navigator. I highly recommend that tool.
Okay.
It's allows you to look at all of my mappings at once and kind of flick through them by safeguard. If you want to get involved, if you want to get very involved, you can sign up for Workbench, and everything that I do is up on Workbench within a week of me doing it. CIS Workbench is a tool for wrangling our volunteers, so that's where the draft versions of all of my controls are up on. But the CIS Controls Navigator page is, I think, your go-to for all things mapping. I'm very, very fond of it.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, just to be clear, again, we're a nonprofit, but we really are driven by volunteerism. And Workbench is our closed social media platform where volunteers interact and create products and manage all that. And anyone on this that's listening to this could certainly be a part of that community if you would like to. And it's a model where we use volunteerism to create products, right? That I always say volunteer labor works best with a professional staff, and that's what we are at CIS, right? All these amazing volunteers. And if you knew some of the folks that work on CIS projects, some of you have mentioned you've contributed to benchmarks or whatever. All right, this is talent you wish you could hire, and they're willing to do volunteer work on behalf of the community, right? As as part of their give back to what we do here in the industry. So we manage all that. Essentially, every product we produce at CIS is given away at no charge to the public. We fund the nonprofit through both a membership model, right? If you want support and tools and that kind of stuff from us, then you could pay to be a member. But the actual access to the content is by design freely available. And again, you can participate directly in the community if you want to be a part of it.
And I'm thinking out loud here. I'm guessing you call it volunteerism and not simply crowdsourcing, because with crowdsourcing there's an implied you might get paid somewhere down the line.
Perhaps so, but again, but the idea is to provide sort of professional support.
Yeah, it's probably very carefully crafted legal language that you guys use, so nobody's fooled. Our time, unfortunately, is winding down. I want to express my appreciation to both of you for coming on today and sharing some thoughts about the mapping of frameworks and giving a little bit of credence to PCI. I always like to hear that because I am kind of biased that way. I will mention, Thomas, if you're interested, I actually did a little project on my own, I guess about 2 years ago now. But we had Katie Nichols, who at the time was working for MITRE, come on the main show to talk about MITRE Attack Framework, and I finally asked questions about it because I've been hearing about it for a while. And as is usually the case, I thought, I bet you PCI's got everything in it, so why not just skip all this stuff and go right to PCI? So I mapped the PCI. I mapped attack, especially the mitigations, to the PCI DSS controls just to see how they lined up. If you're interested in seeing the results of my work, I'd be happy to share that with you. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, Tony. I would love to have you back on the main show sometime. And Paul would love to pepper us with questions about life in the 80s and 90s at NSA.
Or 70s.
Well, you 70s. I was in grade school in the 70s, sir.
Nice try, Jeff.
All right, whatever. So that's going to wrap for us today on Security and Compliance Weekly. Special thanks to Adrian and Tyler for pitching in at the last minute as co-hosts. I wish Kat and Flea, who at the last minute couldn't be with us today, well in their endeavors. I think Flea's still busy unpacking. He was moving last week, and Kat wasn't up to it today, but hope she's feeling better very soon. Next week on Security and Compliance Weekly, we will be joined by Rick McElroy. He is the principal cybersecurity strategist for VMware, and he wants to talk to us about security industry burnout, both from a personal and from a system perspective. So, join us next week if you want to hear a little bit about burnout. And also, just a last-minute reminder to me as much as anybody else, and you, Tyler, Paul Security Weekly this week is Wednesday, not Thursday. That's going to wrap us for us this week. Stay safe, stay secure, stay compliant, and we'll see you next week.